Hello everyone, my name is John Mark Johnson Jr. I am the host of Relationship and Truth, and today we're going to do the third part in the series on the Apocrypha for the Potter's Clay Church out of Hazleton, Idaho. In particular, we're going to be talking about good reasons to reject the Ecclesiasticals. And for those of you who may not have seen the previous videos, the first video, well, that was technically for another church, but I went ahead and used it for this one because the material was already done. But at first, we just discussed what the Apocrypha is, talked about where that term comes from historically, and we also discussed the fact that it's actually not the most historically accurate term. We've determined that a better term would be Ecclesiasticals, and so that's what we've been using throughout the rest of the videos. So yeah, the first video was basically just on what is the Apocrypha and what's the historical situation there, and why Apocrypha is not a particularly good way to refer to those books. Ecclesiasticals is a better way to refer to them. In the second video, the last video that I did for the Potter's Clay Church, we discussed some of the poor reasons that are out there for why people reject the Ecclesiasticals or why Protestants reject the Apocrypha. And yeah, there's a lot of reasons that are given out there that sound good at first blush, but when you actually look into them in a little bit more detail, they turn out not to be very good. So this time, we're going to talk about what would be some good reasons to reject these books, to reject the Apocrypha, to reject the Ecclesiasticals. And unlike all of the reasons that we've talked about so far, we're going to go ahead and actually start with what the Bible has to say about how we know what things are from God and what things are not from God. So, what does the Bible say about the canon? Now, the Bible doesn't actually use that term canon. That's a term that developed in history to demarcate which books we think are authoritative and which ones not. That's a later development. That's a later term. The Bible itself doesn't, of course, use that kind of language, but the Bible itself does give us indications as to how we can know what is from God and what isn't. And this, of course, goes all the way back to the beginning. Because as soon as God started speaking to his people, there was going to be at least the potential for people to get it wrong, to not realize what was given by him and what was maybe something that other people tried to present as if it was from God. And so there were standards literally all the way back to the time of Moses that dealt with these issues. The first one that we have mentioned in the canon for us is in the book of Deuteronomy, or at least the classic reasons for classic criteria as to how we know something is from God or not. The first one is agreement with prior authoritative revelation. This is something that is talked about in Deuteronomy chapter 13. There's also a relevant passage over in Deuteronomy 31 as well. But in Deuteronomy 13, one of the things that the Israelites are told through Moses is that if somebody comes with power like Moses had, and was able to perform great signs and miracles, but what this new person taught didn't agree with what God said at first, that person was speaking falsely, that person was not really from God. And of course, originally when God was speaking to his people, he used particular people to do so. It was only later on that stuff had written down, and so the first point of contact with the material that came from God was the people who God had appointed to speak to the people. And the first criteria that God lays out for them is that this person cannot be contradicting what was already said. The second standard shows up in Deuteronomy 18, and it is that this person who is speaking the things of God, if they are truly of God, that they must have authority that is specifically falsifiable. That is, what they say might sound fairly reasonable, but if they claim to have power from God to verify who they are, that power actually ought to be authentically powerful. The specific example that's given in Deuteronomy 18, or at least one of the examples that's given in Deuteronomy 18, is that if somebody claims that something is going to happen, they're given a gift of foresight by God to see into the future, and it turns out that what that person predicted doesn't actually come to pass, that person has been a false speaker on the behalf of God. That person really wasn't speaking the things of God, because God gets things right. His power really is powerful. And then the final standard, at least of the major standards, there's several others in the Bible that you could go through, but these are the major categories. The final standard we see in Deuteronomy chapter 19, and that is the standard of authenticity that is investigable. Authenticity that can be investigated. These are the standards by which people originally knew who was actually speaking from God and who wasn't. And those things that were originally spoken eventually got written down, and that is eventually where the Bible comes from. It was from statements that were basically originally said by people who met these criteria, eventually getting written down. Now, there are a lot of pieces and parts to that, and in that we would, if we wanted to do a thorough job of talking about these three criteria and how they really relate to the Bible in detail, that could be a very long discussion, and I actually already have a discussion like that on the channel, and so I'm not going to go into all of that right here and now. However, I probably will include that other video in this playlist, just for the people who want to go into all the detail, because further detail would need to talk about the prophets in the Bible, how exactly they relate to these things, the apostles in the Bible, how they relate to these three criteria, what exactly are the different types of prophets, what are the different types of apostles. That could actually be a very involved discussion there, but we don't really have time for that. Like I said, I will try to remember to put that other video that I had done a while back in this playlist, just so that you can cover it if you need to. But what I want to hit today is this final standard right here, the standard of authenticity that is investigable. That is, there are issues that we are historically removed from, and so we're not necessarily going to have direct access to all of the people involved. We don't have things transmitted, with video evidence, a lot of times in history. And the further back you go, typically the more scant that evidence is. And so if we want to study these kinds of things that come to us kind of slantwise, we sometimes need broad tools to figure out what's really going on. And the standard of authenticity in the Bible is a very broad standard. The Bible presents it to us as a standard, but doesn't go into a whole lot of details. We're given specific examples of when the standard of authenticity is used, of people in the Bible checking to make sure that the other person really was speaking truthfully. But those are just specific examples. The Bible doesn't ever limit what can be a standard of authenticity. The only standard is that the only criteria for the standard, I should say, is that it actually has to be a reasonable judge of what is actually authentic. It has to be a reliable standard. And as long as it's reliable, within a Christian understanding of what reliability would have to be, it's acceptable. For example, not in the subject of which books and parts of books that we use, here in the question of the Apocrypha and the Ecclesiasticals, let's broaden it out a little bit to what kind of standards Christians would want to see used in, say, the legal realm. When somebody is brought in for trial, what are the kinds of things that Christians would want to see as evidence. For example, one fairly good form of evidence might be, say, fingerprinting or DNA evidence. Now, those standards do have their weaknesses. For example, even though fingerprints are fairly unique, there's only so many variations, that are possible. And it is very much so possible for computers and individuals who are checking these things to occasionally make mistakes. We could probably rule out, the vast majority of potential suspects by doing fingerprints, but that doesn't necessarily guarantee the results either. You can cut out a lot of people because their fingerprints don't match, but just because the fingerprints do match, or at least appear to match, that doesn't mean that it actually that person is actually truly guilty. Because there are people out there whose fingerprints are actually fairly similar. And with just a simple visual reference, either through interpreted through a computer's optical system or through, just human eyes, it's not necessarily going to be able to differentiate between people who have really close fingerprints. Like I said, it can definitely weed a lot of people out, but it does have limitations in being able to pick out the exact offender. And similar problems can happen with DNA evidence as well, is that a lot of DNA evidence is partial, just because doing a complete sequencing of every person, frankly, takes a lot of time. And so most of the time when DNA tests are done, they are done on partial strands of DNA and not whole. And frankly, human DNA from one person to the next is actually fairly similar. Species cannot survive as species if their DNA is not similar to other people in the same species. That's just the way that works. And so it is there again. DNA can be used to rule out potential suspects, but just because someone's DNA happens to be similar to DNA found at the crime scene doesn't necessarily guarantee that that's the right person. So those are standards of authenticity that Christians would want to see used, as long as they're informed of the limitations, because they are fairly reliable and they have usefulness, at least in one aspect of a trial. Weeding out potential suspects, they're pretty good for that. Guaranteeing that this is the right guy, that's a little different story, but they can at least weed out a lot of people. And those kinds of standards are the kinds of standards that Christians would be interested in. Like I said, the Bible doesn't talk about fingerprints. The Bible doesn't talk about DNA evidence, but the Bible does talk about authenticity in the general sense and gives several examples of people who are investigating things and the kinds of standards that they use. And it's understood that we as human beings, we're not going to have a perfect understanding of everything, but there are methods and tools that are available to us that are fairly reliable, at least at particular tasks, and it is okay for us as Christians to use those standards so long as we are aware of what their limitations are. It's perfectly legitimate to do. So we talked a little bit about the kind of standards that Christians might want in a trial setting. Let's talk about the Ecclesiasticals now. When it comes to the Ecclesiasticals, when it comes to the Apocrypha, there are two major standards that are relevant that are out there. They are textual criticism and source surveys. Textual criticism, we're not going to be able to camp on too much today. Again, my video channel has my Relationship and Truth channel, I should say. I have two video channels, but the Relationship and Truth channel has a lot of material in it on textual criticism, and there's actually a playlist that I have in there that's just on the subject of textual criticism from various people in that field. Some of them are my videos, some of them come from Dr. James White, some of them come from Dr. Daniel Wallace. There's quite a few people that are mentioned in that playlist. If you want to study textual criticism, the resources are all there. But in this video, I'm not going to take a whole lot of time to talk about it, but I will say that textual criticism is the one that helps us deal with the additions and addendums that are found in the Apocrypha or in the Ecclesiasticals. At the beginning of all this, we mentioned that the Apocrypha proper, as it's identified by Protestants, includes parts of books, not complete books, but parts of books that Protestants reject. For example, the portions that are called the additions to Esther, or the additions to Daniel, or addendums like the Prayer of Manasseh. Those are parts that are rejected by Protestants, and the way that we would justify that rejection is through the discipline of textual criticism. Textual criticism is a discipline that has been developed basically to help us understand which version of a text is most authentic. It doesn't answer the question of whether or not this title, this book, belongs in the canon or not, but rather what it says is, does this particular portion of the text belong in the canon or not? Is this portion authentic, or was this a later addition? And again, there's lots of pieces and parts to it. And like I said, I have multiple playlists that deal with this, and one big playlist that's just basically nothing but textual criticism that deals with this in a lot more detail. But basically it is the discipline of reconstructing ancient texts from evidence that you have in the present, trying to work your way back. And so that's how we answer those kinds of questions. That's the reason why we don't accept the additions to Esther and Daniel, is because on text critical grounds, we can say that these are not reasonably, we cannot reasonably say that these are authentic. Like I said, when it comes to standards of authenticity that Christians are allowed to use, we understand that in our human frailty we can get things wrong and that we don't understand everything. But there are standards out there that are pretty reliable, that can give us reasonable results. Like I said, fingerprints can be used to exclude suspects, DNA can be used to exclude suspects. That's perfectly legitimate to use in a trial as far as Christians would be concerned. And similarly, those standards of textual criticism that are actually reasonably strong, and there are some that are strong and some that are weak, and the videos that are out there talk about it. But as long as the standard of textual criticism is relatively strong, we have every good reason to believe that it is useful in those kinds of things. So why don't we accept those parts of books and those addendums and such things? It's because according to text critical standards, those portions are not likely to be authentic. Like I said, we could go into a whole lot more detail there, but in the interest of time, we're not going to do it. Like I said, there's plenty of other material out there, plenty of other videos that I've done and lots of other people have done that discuss that. What we're going to focus on is this standard here. This is the source surveys. And this is kind of what Protestants did in the beginning, although in a very limited fashion. Protestants at the beginning of the Protestant Reformation had the kind of the mantra, the motto of ad fontes, to the fount, to the source. And one of the sources that they happened to look at was, of course, Jerome. The early church father Jerome, who was responsible for a good amount of material in the Vulgate, not technically all of it, but the better portion of it at least. They looked at his stuff and found that he didn't think that all the books that were included in the Vulgate were all canonical, and he called them Apocrypha, so the early Protestants called them Apocrypha, and the rest is history, as they say. That idea of looking back into the past and seeing what people were talking about and what people were doing, that is a good idea. But like we said at the very beginning of this, that term Apocrypha that Jerome used, he wasn't using it in the same way that other early church fathers used it. The problem with the early Protestants' use of sources is that their use of sources was extremely limited. Like I said, basically Jerome. Now, of course, Jerome is really important in the Western Church because he's, the guy that basically starts the Vulgates and all that, the Latin Vulgate that the Western Church would use for like 1,000 years. Definitely an important guy, but he is, at the end of the day, just one historical church father. So as to why Protestants in the here and now would reject the Apocrypha, realizing that basically relying on a single source is probably not a good practice. What Protestants in the here and now would be what would be good for them to do would be to do a more thorough source survey. And there actually have been many Protestants who have done that, who have looked at a lot of the early church sources and some of the early Jewish sources, so on and so forth. And by looking through all of these sources, would start to get a picture of what Scripture actually looked like in the early church. Now, a lot of times when those source surveys are done by Protestants, it's usually basically in book form, in reading form. You go through and read an excerpt from an early church father and, draw some conclusions about that. Okay, this church father did accept these books, he didn't accept those books, these were the concerns, those weren't the concerns, da-da-da-da-da. Then you move on to the next church father, read through his material and, summarize the results afterwards and keep going through it until you finally build up a picture of what's going on, and frankly, you wind up with a book when you're done. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. The problem with that, though, from my perspective, is that I like to have my results a little bit more neat than that. I like to have them in a better summary form, rather than, having to sift through everything, which is good. And I would encourage people to go through the source material as much as you can. But especially for purposes of demonstration, for a lecture like this, being able to summarize the results neatly and succinctly is really helpful. And so, like a lot of the other people who came before me, I went ahead and did a source survey, but at one time, this was like back in 2016 or something like that. Let me go ahead and go on to the next screen here, because that's where I start talking about it. Yeah, it was back in 2016 that I did my own survey of 22 pre-Ephesus Christian sources that talked about the various canonical and ecclesiastical works. Like I said, I'm not really doing anything new there, and actually that survey that I did was based on some stuff that some other people did online. The main difference, though, is that I decided to attach numbers to it so that I could have a little bit neater results, and so that's what we're going to be talking about for basically the rest of this video. Let's talk a little bit about the actual sources that were used, though. Here's a list of the church fathers that I looked at. If you want the exact sources, those are in my book Sword that's available online. If you look at some of my previous videos, there will be a link to it there, free to download and all that kind of thing. You go to the very end of the book, and there's some appendices in the very end of the book, and one of the appendices has all of the source citations in it. So if you want to be able to look up these sources yourself, they are there, they are out there. If somebody wants me to provide a more direct link, just put a comment down in the comment section, and I will link the book there so that you can look things up. But these sources go all the way from Josephus in the 1st century to Pope Innocent I in the early 5th century. And the reason why I basically took a snapshot of this period of time is because of just kind of the historical situation that was going on. Whenever you do a survey and try to determine what a group of people did or did not believe, or how they tended to group things, etc., whenever you do a historical survey like this, you always want to pick endpoints that are meaningful and duly take into account the historical situation. So why we would want sources, basically from the 1st century onward is fairly obvious, and then that is the period in which the New Testament was written, was the 1st century. So we want sources that are basically as close to the 1st century as we can get, so they're as close to when the books of the canon were finished. So basically right after the books were written, we want to get as close to that as possible, but there is a limitation there. You'll notice that 1st century sources that we have here, there's only 2 of them. There's Josephus and there's 1st Clement. And in the 2nd century, we only have like 3 sources. And the 3rd century, we only have like 1 source. The reason why the early centuries have so little sources, so few people that we can look at, is just because those early centuries, of course, were early, and the further back in history you go, the less records from that time period are going to survive. So if we want a decent survey that's actually going to give us a decent amount of information, it would be nice if we had 100 people within the first century or two right after the New Testament was finished to base all of our results on. The problem is that we just don't have that many records that actually talk about these things from the early period. And in fact, a lot of these real early sources like Josephus and First Clement, Melito is actually fairly detailed. Mercer and Fragment's fairly detailed. Irenaeus is somewhat problematic, but yeah, Josephus and First Clement and Irenaeus, for example, those three we don't actually have proper lists from in terms of what books they used and what books they didn't use. Instead, we just have their writings that have survived and what works they reference in those writings. So we don't even have proper lists from them. Like I said, the further back you go in history, the more tangential things tend to be. And so if you want, and of course, some of these people are very, very, very close to when the New Testament itself was written, and depending on where they are, and depending on where the books were originally written from, because the New Testament books were written at various places. For example, the Apostle John seems to have written a lot of his stuff around Ephesus. Paul's writings were kind of written throughout his travels, and so there's a pretty big region that is associated with his writings. There are, of course, some writings that came out of Israel itself. Think the Gospel of Mark, which is attributed to the companion of Peter, writing on Peter's behalf, basically, is where we get the Gospel of Mark. That one was written in Rome. But yeah, the New Testament was written all over the place, and so it took a while for those books to circulate, and so a lot of the early church fathers don't necessarily have a list because they haven't encountered all of the books yet. It takes a while for those books to start circulating. So the really early church fathers, the really early sources, are kind of partial, unfortunately. But as time goes on, we start to get in more and more mentions, and they start to become more and more detailed. That's just the way that history works. So we would like to have as many early sources as possible, but we understand that early sources are going to be relatively rare. So that's a limitation that all historical surveys have. So as much as we would like to limit it to just, the first century or two after the New Testament was written, the fact of the matter is we just don't have enough data from that time period for it to be particularly relevant. Another issue that goes on with the early sources is that the early Christians were persecuted. They were first persecuted by the Jews, and then they were persecuted by the Romans. And they were actually persecuted by the Romans clear up until 311 or 313 AD into the early 4th century. That's when Christianity finally became a religio licita, that is a legal religion. Before it was a religio illicita, an illegal religion. It wasn't until the early 4th century that happened, somewhere around 311, 313 AD. So before that, Christianity was, of course, persecuted by various people, like I said, early on the Jews and then the Romans. And the Christians in that early time period were not overly keen to give people a complete list of everything that they used, because especially the Romans were prone to taking Christian documents and burning them, trying to stop the dissemination of this material as much as they could. And so the Romans especially would burn a lot of Christian books, and if Christians, started giving them lists of what exactly is in their canon and what isn't, that would not have been good. So, like I said, it isn't until after the peace of the church, like I said, either in 311 or 313, when the Roman Empire finally said, okay, it's okay for you guys to be Christians, we're going to stop persecuting you. It isn't until the peace of the church that we would actually even expect lists of the Bible to become common. And so that's another reason why we can't just stop with the first century or two. Why we have to go past that is because lists just are not a good idea during that period of persecution. So you want your list, your survey, to include material that comes from later people who are at liberty to go ahead and write up lists and publish them widely. And that's what we see in the historical sources here. In the 3rd century, over here with Origen, like I said, on this survey, we've only got one guy from the 3rd century, because the 3rd century was actually particularly bad in terms of persecution. And there's only one guy that we have from that time period that I'm aware of who actually bothered to go through and actually write any kind of detailed lists, just because of the persecution at the time. But in the century immediately following, in the 4th century, after the peace of the church, then you've got a ton of people that are writing lists of various kinds. So you've got Eusebius, right after the peace of the church, which was, like I said, either in 311 AD or 313 AD. He starts putting out lists. Cyril of Jerusalem has a list. Hilary of Poitiers has a list. The Keltenham list is also 4th century. Pretty much all of these are 4th century, right up through Augustine, and then we just have a few more after that, and I'll discuss why we stopped it at that point. But yeah, most of the lists that we have in history come after the peace of the church, because that's the point where Christians can actually put out lists without, getting in trouble with the Romans, and the Romans stopping by and say, hey, thanks for the list. Now we know what books to burn. That the early Christians didn't want to do that before the peace of the church, while they were still under persecution. But yeah, as soon as the peace of the church came, after the Romans said, okay, you are a legal religion now, then yeah, like everybody and their dog put out lists. And so we just get an explosion of that kind of material in the 4th century that we didn't have in the previous centuries. So like I said, we can't stop it in the 1st or 2nd century because we don't have a whole lot of sources that survive from that time period. We also can't stop it in the 1st or 2nd century or even the 3rd century because persecution was a thing back then. And so a lot of people didn't want to put out lists that the Romans could use against them. So we definitely want to wait until after the peace of the church to stop our survey. But we do have to have a stopping point. If we continue the survey far enough, we're going to get into the period of the traditional churches, the period where the Western Roman Catholic Church is well established, where the Eastern Orthodox Church is well established, and we know what those churches eventually did. They eventually adopted, in one form or another, a fairly long canon that we know runs counter to what the Protestants would accept. We know that traditional churches tend to be traditional, which means they tend to keep things, and the list of things that they tend to keep through history tends to grow and grow. That's kind of how traditionalism is. Something gets added at some point and it gets maintained. Something gets added at another point and it gets maintained, and so it just grows and grows and grows. And this isn't just an issue with the traditional churches, it's with all traditions. That's the way all tradition works. That's an established thing that doesn't really have to, that's just an established trend that we would expect to happen with regard to, any kind of tradition anywhere. Eventually a lot of things get added to tradition that we know are not authentic. For example, and this isn't an issue of the Bible, it isn't an issue of the canon, but just consider Christmas traditions, for example, and we'll take a favorite figure during Christmas time, like Santa Claus, and the things that we say about Santa Claus now that has become a part of the tradition surrounding Santa Claus versus previous generations, there has been a lot of outgrowth. Now we've got so much that has been in books and movies and all these other things that can surround, and the things that Santa has done and the kinds of things that Santa does do and the technology that Santa does or doesn't have, the tradition around that has just grown over time. But if you go back into previous periods, like, the 1900s, the 20th century, that was a little bit different from what we have now in the 21st century. And if you go back even previous to that, in the 19th century, back in the 1800s, what was believed about Santa Claus then was much more limited than it was in the 20th century or now in the 21st century. what we've believed about Santa Claus, at least as part of the tradition about Santa Claus has just grown and grown and grown. We know that that's what happens with any tradition, is that tradition grows over time. So if we continue the survey all the way up to the period of the traditional churches where they're well established, we know where that's going to go. We know that there's going to be a traditional bias because there's a traditional bias in everything. So we have to have an endpoint. And what I have picked for the endpoint is the Council of Ephesus. When I say 22 pre-Ephesus Christian sources, the Ephesus that I'm talking about is the Council of Ephesus. What was that? 431 AD. And the reason why I picked that as the cutoff point is because that is the point at which you get the first significant schism in Orthodox Christianity. There were schisms of various sorts that happened beforehand, but they were usually with people who weren't Orthodox Christians, like the Gnostics. They were not Orthodox Christians in any way, shape, or form. Or the earlier schisms were reconciled. For example, the Donatist schism was with people that were generally Orthodox, certainly much more than the Gnostics ever were. But those schisms were healed with time. And so those were divisions that existed for a time, but they didn't last. Ephesus is where we start to see the first crack in Orthodox Christianity that would actually produce lasting effects. And the church that split off from that was the Church of the East. I believe the other name for them is the Assyrian Church. And while there has been some official, sorry, we misunderstood you guys, kind of thing from Rome, and those kinds of things, the Assyrian Church itself, they have still maintained an independent status of Rome and the other traditional churches. They say, okay, the differences that we had at the time, we agree that they're not as big as we made them out to be, but we still really don't want to join you guys. So like I said, in terms of lasting differences in how the churches are organized, who they fall under, those kinds of things that maintain independence and have maintained independence, that was Council of Ephesus where that started. So the sources that we have here go as close to the first century and even into the first century, and up to sources that we have canon data from clear up into the 5th century, but before the Council of Ephesus, because that's when the different factions of orthodoxy start to come into existence. And technically there were differences that kind of came before that had to deal with language differences and things like that, but when it really started becoming official was the Council of Ephesus. All right, so that is why I picked the sources that I did, why I picked those endpoints. Okay, wanted to get as early as I could. Definitely had to pick a point that was after the peace of the church, because otherwise you're just not going to have a whole lot of list data before the peace of the church. But we have to pick an endpoint, and we already know what's going to happen with tradition. We know that the lists are going to grow as tradition goes on, so we have to pick an endpoint that's somewhat meaningful. And the one that I picked was the Council of Ephesus, because that's where orthodoxy itself starts to schism with lasting schisms. All right, so hopefully that makes some sense of the sources and why I picked them. Now, in terms of how I put this all together, because like I said, most of the Protestants who have done this, I'm certainly not the first, but most of the Protestants who have done this have basically just done it in book form. Okay, give the quote from the church father, summarize it. Give another quote from another church father, summarize it. Eventually get to the end of the book and have the summary of all the summaries, and those are your results. I like to have things presented in a little bit more succinct fashion, and I'm also a numbers guy, I'm a math guy, so I took all of the data from the written sources and put it into a numerical form, and I basically did a point system, and this little diagram here is to basically just describe how I went from what was mentioned in the sources to some kind of a numerical value. So these are sources that list the books of the Bible in one way, shape, or form. If the list was in favor of including a particular book, I gave it a +1. So let's say one of the sources is Billy Bob, and Billy Bob happens to like the books of Matthew and John. And he says Matthew and John, the Gospel of Matthew, the Gospel of John, those are both in the Bible. Over on my little tally, I would give those each 1 point. But let's say that Billy Bob doesn't happen to mention some books. He doesn't mention the other two Gospels. In my point system, I would give those a 0 because he isn't saying he's for it or he's against it. He just simply doesn't mention it. So I gave those a 0 value. If he clearly excludes something, he talks about something like, say, the Gospel of Thomas. Don't go looking through your Bible, it's not in there. But if he is talking about something like the Gospel of Thomas, there actually was a work in history that's called the Gospel of Thomas. There's actually two. There's the Proto-Gospel, or the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, and then there is kind of this semi-Gnostic adult Gnostic Gospel of Thomas. Neither of them are authentic. But still historically interesting, if nothing else. But let's say he's aware of the Gospel of Thomas, but he clearly doesn't think it's authentic. If he clearly excludes it as being authentic to the Bible, then I gave it a -1 point. So +1 if the source is for it, 0 if they don't say one way or the other, -1 point if they clearly exclude it and say, nope, that's definitely not in the Bible, that's definitely not in the canon. Now, there were some of the sources, especially the early sources, where we don't really have proper lists from them. We just have the sources that they mention and don't mention, and kind of have to really piece things together and make, frankly, some guesses. And if they were sources where we kind of had to guess what they were or were not doing, or if it wasn't a proper list, it's just tallying up all the quotations that they had in the works and trying to figure out where those quotations went to. Those ones I only used half values for. Again, if they don't say anything, there's not really any value to assign to that. That would be 0. But if the source that is kind of questionable seems to lean in the particular way of a book being included, that was a ½ point positive. And if it seemed to lean against a source being included, but still the source itself was kind of sketchy, gave it a -½ point. All right, and let me go ahead and just show that to you guys real quick. Yeah, we can go ahead and discard those. Here is the spreadsheet that I actually used to tally all of these up. So across the top, you'll see the source, and then on the left side, you'll see all of the various books of the Bible, as well as several books that are not books of the Bible but were mentioned by these sources. And then the point values that I would give in between, down in all of these columns, are based on whether they were fully against something, fully for something, fully against something, didn't mention it at all, or if the source itself was kind of questionable, then I'd only do ½ points. For example, Josephus talks about the Old Testament, and he talks about how many books are in the Old Testament, and he talks about the categories of Old Testament books, but he doesn't actually list them specifically. So you kind of have to guess based on how many books total he has and how many books he thinks fits in each category as to what they are. And so that's not really a proper list, so I could only give half values for Josephus. And then you'll also have that with some of the other sources later on. They'll sometimes kind of hedge things or kind of just mention something in passing, and it's really hard to figure out exactly what they meant by it. So occasionally in the spreadsheet, you'll see half values here and there. But yeah, this is all the tally work, everything from Josephus all the way over to the end at Pope Innocent the First, and all the mentions in between. But let's go back to the presentation here. All right, let's see here. We already talked about the values. And I already talked about the whole half value thing with some of the early sources. Josephus, like I said, we don't have a really proper list from. First Clement, we don't have a proper list from. Oops, and I forgot to do the pin here. There we go. So yeah, Josephus, First Clement, and Irenaeus, their lists were not proper lists. It was just material that was gained from their stuff. And so, like I said, those were limited to half values just because of the nature of the source. It's not as inclusive, it's not as full, it's not as detailed as some of the later sources. But they were still early sources that do give us some information about it, and so it's still useful. All right, and then what we wind up with is a set of percentages of uncontested support. That is, we total everything up. The highest total becomes the standard of comparison for everything else, and the individual scores are determined by taking basically how much was for, subtracting what was against it, and then dividing by the highest score possible. So, for example, if we have a total of 7 sources that happen to talk about a particular work, and 2 of them clearly reject the work, they definitely don't like the Gospel of Thomas, and 5 works that definitely do like the Gospel of Thomas, then we would have a percentage of uncontested support of 42.9%. The math is fairly simple. The amount for a source being 5, so 5 people did like the Gospel of Thomas. Subtract those who are definitely against it. There were 2 that are definitely against it. Divide it by the total. Let's say that these 7, even though they disagree about the Gospel of Thomas, they were all in favor of something else, like say the Gospel of Matthew. So that becomes the standard of comparison. That gives you a ratio. You multiply it by 100 to get a percentage, and that is where the 42.9% for that particular example comes from. This percentage of uncontested support is used instead of just a regular percentage. A regular percentage would say, okay, how many people are in favor of this work versus how many people total were there. The normal percentage would be 5 out of 7 for our example. The reason why I didn't just do a normal percentage is because it doesn't take into account the difference between omission and negative mention. That is, yes, it's important to know that 5 out of the 7 were for the Gospel of Thomas, in our hypothetical example here, but that is not the same. It's not going to hit the ear the same. It doesn't mean the same thing as saying, okay, yeah, there were 5 for it, but were there any against it? Yes, there were 2 that were against it, and you have to take that into account. So that's why the 2 gets subtracted off. If you don't actually subtract off the amount against, you're not told what the other 2 people did. Did they simply omit it? They didn't mention it one way or the other, or were they actively against it? Okay. So that's how these percentages were tallied. And something that needs to also be mentioned about this is that because it's a percentage of uncontested support, the middle position is actually 0, not 50% like with normal percentages. So anything that's above 0 is technically positive, more support for than against. And like I said before, we know how tradition tends to go. Tradition tends to add things. It doesn't tend to take away things, so we would expect most of these values to wind up being positive. They might be close to 0, some of them might be. Some of them might be all the way out at 100. Well, there's a lot of them that would be out at 100. There are a lot of works that were basically uncontested, and we're not going to talk about those because those aren't interesting. We would expect that most of the values would come out positive just because that's the way that tradition tends to go. Don't be surprised by that. Like I said, we would expect that to be the case because all the traditional churches wound up with basically different versions of the canon, but they all wound up with fairly big versions of the canon, and that's just because that's what tradition does. Tradition tends to grab things and keep things and just add as time goes on. So most of these values are going to come out positive rather than being 0 or negative. That we would expect. What we're looking for is, can we prove historically that there are actually 2 different sets of works here that should be treated differently? We're not interested in what happened eventually. We already know what happened eventually. The traditional churches wound up with a lot of stuff. They wound up with somewhat different stuff, and the different churches have different versions of the canon, but they all wound up with relatively big canons. That's not really surprising. We already know that result. what we want to figure out is, do we have any evidence that these works were originally treated differently? That's what we're looking for. So we're looking for a separation between one category of works and another category of works. Let's first look at the Old Testament works. These are the Old Testament works that those sources actually had some degree of contestability to them. They were not universally in favor one way or the other. You'll notice that as far as works that Protestants would have in our canon, the 12 Minor Prophets were somewhat debated in this early period, and the Book of Esther was somewhat debated in this early period. But all the other Old Testament works that Protestants normally have in their Old Testament, I haven't listed here because those were all 100% support for. That is, all the other works were not contested to any degree at all, and because of that, there's no point in talking about all the other Protestant Old Testament books. These are the only ones that were at all contestable. Now, I do need to mention that the reason why the 12 Minor Prophets on the list is because Origen seems to have forgot them in his list. He goes through and he gives a number of books that he thinks belongs in the Old Testament. However, the number of names that he gives doesn't match that total. And so most people who look at Origen, he was the guy from the 3rd century, by the way, that we mentioned. When most people look at his list of Old Testament works, they say, yeah, he doesn't mention the 12 Minor Prophets, but he probably meant to include it, he just forgot. And so that is why the 12 Minor Prophets shows up here as being slightly contestable, and it's just because Origen probably forgot them. Like I said, he gives the correct number of books, but he doesn't give that number of names of books. And so, yeah, he probably meant to include it, but technically he didn't. So I gave it a half point because he probably meant to include it, but he also didn't say it. So that's why the 12 Minor Prophets shows up on the list. The Book of Esther, on the other hand, that is a very, very different story. The Book of Esther actually was contested by several early church fathers. Just abbreviating here. Early church fathers. Let's see, there was at least Melito. Josephus might actually possibly be on that list of people that question Esther as well. Possibly Josephus, definitely Melito, definitely Athanasius. Nazianzus, I think, also questioned it. I didn't use this as part of the survey, but it is interesting to note that the Dead Sea Scrolls, which technically come before the end of the New Testament period, and that's why they got excluded from the survey. The Dead Sea Scrolls also do not contain Esther, and for a long time people thought that, it just didn't survive, because that's kind of the way that the Dead Sea Scrolls were. They were just kind of a random collection, and some parts of the collection did survive, some parts didn't, and people thought that for a little while at least that the Dead Sea Scrolls people thought that the Dead Sea Scrolls that they only accidentally didn't include Esther. That is, it just didn't survive for whatever reason, but they probably meant to include it. Well, they got around to translating some of the other works that were in the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls include a lot of biblical works, but they also include a lot of non-biblical works. One of the non-biblical works that they include is a calendar that the Dead Sea Scroll community used, and their calendar actually doesn't include the Feast of Purim, which is the feast that arises out of the events from the Book of Esther. In Esther, of course, the people of God are threatened. Esther comes to their rescue, basically, appealing before the king. The people are able to fight for themselves and basically survive the persecution. And they celebrate their survival, and a feast comes out of that the Jews regularly celebrate, called the Feast of Purim. And what's interesting about the Dead Sea Scroll community is that they didn't celebrate the Feast of Purim. That was not on their calendar. And so after looking at that data, people realized that the Dead Sea Scrolls didn't accidentally omit Esther. It was very intentional. The Dead Sea Scroll community didn't accept Esther as canonical. And like I said, there are several early church fathers, Athanasius, Melito, Nazianzus, possibly Josephus, that also, well, Josephus is not technically an early church father. He's an early Jew whose works were copied and transcribed by Christians because they thought his material talking about the destruction of Jerusalem was useful to know and good history and should be passed on. And that's why we have Josephus' writings today, is because Christians kept his writings around. But yeah, there were several early church fathers who did question Esther, and it's not overly hard to understand why. Esther, especially in its base form, its most Hebrew form of the text, I don't think even once actually specifically mentions Yahweh, actually says God. It is, compared to a lot of other books in the Old Testament, fairly secular. Like I said, few to no mentions of God properly. And it is also talking about a specific point in time that frankly doesn't have a whole lot to do with redemptive history in and of itself. Unlike most of the other books of the Old Testament that are, paving the way very clearly for the coming Messiah, Esther doesn't really relate to that material nearly as strong as most of the other Old Testament books do. It's just kind of off on its own in terms of theme and those kinds of things. And so, yeah, there are a lot of people in the early period that questioned the book of Esther as being fully canonical or not. But you can see that the percentage that comes out for it of uncontested support is still extremely high, 68.6% uncontested support. Like I said, anything above 0 is more than not. And it's still all the way up above 68.6. So yes, you'll see people, even in the modern, even in Protestant circles, still kind of hedge their statements that come out of Esther. They don't like to rely on Esther too much just because they know the history, that Esther was significantly questioned compared to the other books of the Old Testament that Protestants have. This was the one that was easily the most contested. So yeah, people will be a little bit more hesitant to try to base things off of Esther alone in terms of doctrine and theology. But it is still fair to say that most of the early church fathers were still in favor of Esther. Not as strongly as with some others, but for the most part, still fairly there. The next book down on the list is Judith, with only 20% support, 20% uncontested support, I should say. And that is the kind of information that we were actually looking for. Pretty much all of these values for all of these other books that are part of the Ecclesiasticals, Judith, Wisdom of Solomon, Tobit, Sirach, 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 1st and 2nd, 3rd, and 4th Maccabees, the 151st Psalm, all of those we would expect to be positive in terms of their uncontested support, just from the historical tendency of traditions to add up over time. So it doesn't surprise me at all that all of these values are positive for these ecclesiastical works. But what is interesting is the difference between the books that the Protestants would call canonical and these other books that some of the other traditional churches have wanted to include in the canon. This percentage of support in the early period is definitely different. So we have this gap between the Protestant canon, whose lowest book is 68.6% uncontested support, and that's Esther. And then we have 20% uncontested support for the book of Judith, which winds up making it into the traditional church's canons, like the Roman Catholicism, Eastern Orthodoxy, those ones. And the gap between them is a huge gap compared to any other gap on the list. So if you just take the difference between the different values as you go through, the difference between 97 and 68, that's roughly a 30% gap. You take for the ones that are on the Protestant side, and then you look at differences on the ecclesiastical side, and a lot of those differences are fairly small. The biggest gap is easily the gap between Esther and Judith. That gap is a 48.6% gap. That is the information that we were looking for. Did the early church fathers, as a whole, actually treat these sets of works basically the same or basically differently? We know over time that the canon lists are going to grow, because that's just what tradition does. And we know where the traditional churches wound up. They all wound up with long canons. But if we go back in the history and we look at the early church fathers, do we actually see evidence that there was a distinction between these two groups of books? The answer is yes. At the end of our books, the Protestant canon, there was a huge gap between where our books end and the Ecclesiasticals pick up. Okay, and it's that huge gap that allows us to say with confidence that these two groups of books should be treated differently. So with regard to the Old Testament, yes, there are people in history who contested several of the books, the 12 minor prophets and Esther for the Old Testament were somewhat contested. Origin, do we want to count that as being properly contested or not? That's debatable. But yes, at least Esther was certainly contested, but not nearly as much as the other works were. It was very clear that there was a significant portion of the early church that did not favor these books being treated as fully canonical. And numerically, that's where the biggest gap is. And that's where we can say, yes, this is where there was a real distinction that actually shows up in the historical evidence. Like I said, the fact that pretty much all of these turned out positive, well, except for the 151st Psalm down here, but the fact that all of these turn out positive doesn't surprise us in the least, because we know that's the way that tradition tends to go. What we were looking for was a difference between one group and another, and there is a difference between one group and the other. There is a significant jump, or I shouldn't say jump up, because I shouldn't say jump because jump implies upward movement. I should say there's a significant drop in support between Esther and Judith. All the books that are above Esther are relatively close to each other. The books that are below Esther are relatively close to each other, but that gap between Esther and Judith is huge as far as the Old Testament books are concerned, and that represents a very clear difference in how the early church treated these. Mathematically speaking, there is absolutely no doubt whatsoever that these were two different classifications of books. Were these books generally all used by Christians? Yes, you can make that argument that they were all used by early Christians. But were they treated the same with the same level of authority and the same level of confidence? Clearly not. A 48.6% difference is a huge difference in uncontested support. The early church was very, very clearly much more confident about the books that were from Esther upward versus Judith downward. And that is where Protestants would come in and say, this is the reason why we have the Old Testament that we do, is because the early church clearly treated these books distinctly. Yes, they did have respect to one degree or another for all of the books, both the proper Old Testament and the Ecclesiasticals that are associated with the Old Testament. They clearly had some kind of use, some kind of level of respect for them all, but they clearly didn't treat them the same. The books from Esther up were clearly treated with much more authority and much more certainty than the books from Judith downward. Okay, that's what these numbers tell us. And then we can go ahead and we can do the same for the New Testament. Oh, before we move on to the New Testament, I do want to mention this detail here. In some of the previous talks that I've done on this, I mentioned that First Enoch was a work that shows up even in the New Testament. It gets quoted in the book of Jude. However, there is not any of the early church fathers who in their proper lists actually list First Enoch as being biblical. Now, the early church father Origen does happen to mention First Enoch, but he doesn't put it in a part of his list. Whenever he mentions it, it's to say that it's not canonical, and he never mentions it in connection with his list. When he says, here are the books of the Old Testament, he never even bothers to mention First Enoch positively or negatively. When he lists his books of the New Testament, he doesn't mention First Enoch positively or negatively. But there are a couple of his writings where he does mention First Enoch, and it is in writings where he is specifically telling someone who's asked him what he thinks of First Enoch, and he's telling them that he doesn't think that it's authentic. But it's not in any of his lists that he actually gives. So yeah, and like I said, he's basically the only one in the early period who does that. First Enoch, in terms of being canonical, was like on nobody's radar. And Origen did answer some questions about it, but there is absolutely no early church tendency to include First Enoch at all. Thought I'd mention that because, like I said, it does show up in the New Testament, and so people question it, but historically, it wasn't even a question. The closest that we get it to it being a question is Origen talking about it a couple of times, and how, in both cases, he's very clear about it not being a part of the canon, and when he does give the list of books that are in the Bible, it doesn't even show up anywhere near them. All right. Moving on to the works associated with the New Testament, there's a lot more works that were associated with the New Testament that the early church fathers talked about. But again, we see the same thing. Okay, here on the left-hand side, we have all of the works that are associated with the Protestants, that the Protestants would accept as being a part of the New Testament. And yes, some of them are contestable. Philemon, 2 John, 1 Peter, James, 3 John, Jude, 2 Peter, Hebrews, and Revelation. All of those were contested to one degree or another in that early church time period by those early sources that I mentioned. Philemon, that one's more of a technicality because of Irenaeus. And I cannot spell Irenaeus right now. Sorry about spelling that wrong. I know that's spelled wrong. But Irenaeus, he didn't give us any proper lists. He just had the luminous writings in which he quotes several scriptures, and from those quotes we can kind of determine what he had available to him and what he didn't. But there's some works that he doesn't mention. One of them is Philemon. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that Irenaeus didn't have Philemon. It just means that in his writings he never bothered to quote it. But since he didn't bother to quote it, we don't technically know if he had it or not. And so Philemon winds up being technically contested because we don't have complete lists from Irenaeus. But the others, there were people that at least didn't mention it or something like that. But most of them, of course, are in the 90s and 80s, as you can see. Most of the books that Protestants would be confident in had a pretty sizable proportion of uncontested support. That's, like I said, they were debated. And that was a good thing because not everybody had access to all of the books immediately as soon as they were written. And so it took a while for them to be circulated. It took a while for people to investigate them and be confident that a lot of these books were really what they claimed to be. And that is certainly the case with Revelation. The book of Revelation, as far as New Testament books that Protestants would accept, that is easily the most contestable of all the New Testament books, in that there were a number of early church fathers who either just simply omitted it or would even go so far as to exclude it. And it's not hard to figure out why. The book itself is rather strange. I mean, you have a book that is talking about giant locusts with scorpion tails and seven-headed monsters, and it's just got some really, really, really strange stuff in it. And then you also have the practical problem in history that a lot of people would take the book of Revelation and come up with some very interesting interpretations of it, usually doom and gloom, Armageddon type stuff that like every single generation assumed must be about them. We're living in the end times. We're going to see the events of Revelation happen. And like every single generation, you can see people that grab onto the book of Revelation, think that it's written about them, go off and do something totally crazy like around the turn of the first millennium, they said, well, the 1,000-year reign of Revelation has ended, and so Christ is going to come back this year, and so we don't need to bother, planting crops for next year because it's all going to end anyway. So, we'll just take the year off and enjoy, and meet Christ when he comes, and it'll all be great. And lots of people died, unfortunately. The book of Revelation caused a lot of problems in church history. And like I said, the book itself was very strange. And so it's no surprise whatsoever that Revelation was the one that was most contested in the early church period. It was the one that was most frequently abused by heretics. It was very strange in terms of its contents. There really isn't any surprise that Revelation wound up being as contested as it was. But you'll still see that it is not only positive, like we would expect a lot of these to be, just because of how tradition works, but it's not only positive, but it's well over the 50% mark of uncontested support. Not just of support, but uncontested support is still above 50%. And the important difference for us as Protestants, like I said, we're looking for differences in groups. Is one group of books treated significantly different than another? And the answer to that is yes. Between Revelation and 1 Clement, which is the next best supported, between those two, there is a huge gap of greater than 40%, and that is the biggest gap on the page here. Just like in the last slide, the biggest gap was between Esther and Judith, clearly delineating what Protestants would call the canonical books from what we would call the Old Testament Ecclesiasticals. Similarly, here we see a huge gap between what we would call the Protestant New Testament, Revelation on up, and what we would call the Ecclesiasticals for the New Testament, which would basically be 1 Clement on down. Now, what is interesting in the New Testament is we actually do get some negative values. Everything from the Apocalypse of Peter on down the list are all negative. And that is actually really surprising historically, because like I said, historically, traditions tend to grow. They don't tend to get smaller. But these were works that were so far out of character for the New Testament and for Christianity in general, that pretty much everyone who came into contact with them, there were a few people here and there who liked them, but on the whole, Christians were actually pretty consistent in saying, not only are these works not canon proper, they're also not particularly good. They're not even particularly orthodox. They're not even good for us to read. Not canonical, but they're actually so different that they could actually be thought of as counter-canonical. This is actually what the word Apocrypha would usually originally apply to. Back in the early church period, they actually used the word Apocrypha to describe works that were especially dubious, especially works that were associated with the Gnostics. And it would usually be these kinds of works, the Apocalypse of Peter on down, that would get called Apocrypha, that would get called Gnostic. And there's some of them that definitely were, like the Gnostic Gospel of Thomas is a great example of that. Yes, early church fathers did mention it. That's how it shows up in this list here. These works that I have here are only the works that were mentioned in those 22 sources that I mentioned before. So early church fathers were aware of these works that come from the Gnostics and whatnot. But for the most part, they were pretty consistent in saying, no, those works are not a part of us. Those are of a fundamentally different character. They do not belong with the other works that we have. But there were a few that made it into the positive side. First and Second Clements are the main ones that the early church fathers were pretty consistent in saying that these are at least good to read. There wasn't nearly as much support for them as the ones that would be in the canon proper for Protestants. But they would say these at least contain some historical information that is relevant, and it's historical And it comes from a perspective that is actually within the umbrella of Orthodox Christianity, whereas these other ones were not Orthodox. They were not from a truly Orthodox perspective. But yeah, they did show awareness of a lot of them, and they were very consistent in saying that these are not a part of us. But yeah, the main point for us as Protestants is not saying, there were contested books in history. Of course there are contested books in history. People contest things all the time. Of course they're going to contest the books of the Bible, and not all of the books of the Bible are going to have the same degree of support of other books of the Bible. That's just human history. But what we are able to do by doing these kinds of surveys, which is basically what the early Protestants did in looking up this material from Jerome, their survey was just very limited to one source. These days we have far better access to all these historical sources, and what we can do is say, okay, yes, these things were tested in history. That's exactly what we expect. People contest things. That's human nature. What we're interested in, though, is can we see historically where groups of books were treated distinctly, where there is a gap in how these books were treated. And yes, there are very clear gaps between what Protestants would call canonical and what other groups might be tempted to include in their canons. And like I said, the biggest gap for the New Testament is between Revelation and 1 Clement. That's why the New Testament for Protestants ends with Revelation. It's part of a completely different category than the others. And in the Old Testament, we already mentioned it, but the clear gap was between Esther and Judith. That's where the biggest gap is in each one of these with regard to each testament, Old Testament, New Testament. The gaps that we're looking for are exactly where the early Protestants said that they probably were, and it turns out that they were right. And now we can say that not just on the basis of what Jerome said, but what early church sources from the first century on up to, from the late first century on up to the early 5th century had to say. That entire span of time, looking at the early church fathers, we can say that clearly the Protestant canon was treated differently from all of these other works. Doesn't mean that the early church fathers, hated all of these other works. No, clearly they didn't. They saw some value in them, but there is still a distinct difference in the early church sources between them. And that's why Protestants have the canon that we do, and why we make the distinction that we do. It is what happened historically. Okay, yes, Protestants kind of got a little bit ahead of themselves with just referring to Jerome's stuff. Okay, it did turn out that Jerome actually had something there, but it also turns out that if we look at the early church period more broadly, that really is borne out. And like I said, we live in a wonderful day and age where we can have access to all this stuff, and we can tally stuff up. And I can make a fairly simple spreadsheet and do all the math on it and get all these numbers. And like I said, see those clear distinctions in how one group of books is treated relative to another group. Like I said, there are clear gaps here. Mathematically speaking, in terms of math and when I'm looking at population statistics, of course there's going to be differences, and some things are going to be contestable and whatnot. Pretty much in every time that I've done any kind of statistics with real world data, you get stuff like that. But from a statistical point of view, I'm not interested in the fact that people contest things. That's normal. I'm not interested in the fact that there are differences in measurements. That's natural variation that's just going to happen in the world as it is. We live in a fallen, broken world, and people don't always agree. Duh. But if I want to say that there is distinctly one population over here and distinctly one population over there, I'm looking for a gap. And both of these sets, for both the Old Testament and the New Testament, very clearly have that gap. And mathematically speaking, statistically speaking, I can say with 100% confidence that these really are two different populations of books. These are really two different treatments of books. Like I said, I put it all in math terms because that's the kind of person I am. Other Protestants have already done these kind of surveys and basically just did it as a verbal argument saying, okay, here's all the church fathers who are on this side, all the church fathers who are on this side, and this is the summary of all those results. I put it in numbers because that's what I understand. But the historical data is very clear. The early church, while they did have regard for some of these books that we are calling the Apocrypha or the Ecclesiasticals more accurately, they did not regard them in the same way that they regarded the books of the Protestant canon. That's the main point here. Historically, we can look through all of this and prove mathematically that there are distinct gaps there. Those are the biggest gaps, and they're exactly where the Protestants predicted that they would, where the Protestants predicted they would be. Okay. Protestants are not afraid of looking at things historically. We're not afraid of investigating things and using historical standards of investigation. That's one of the things that Scripture explicitly tells us to do, is to investigate the authenticity of claims, not just merely accept them, but actually look at them in detail. And we've done that, and we've done that for hundreds of years now, starting with our analysis of Jerome. That was frankly incomplete, but we have gotten so much more material now and been able to synthesize this material so much better now. It's only reinforced what we originally thought, not detracted from it. And this broader basis of evidence is something that we should be very willing to tell people about. All right, so that is the end of this third section. Like I said, in the playlist, I will try to include that other video that I did. It was actually on the topic of Mormonism proper, but the vast majority of the video actually wound up being a discussion of how the biblical standards of canonicity work. I'll try to remember to include that in this playlist. But as far as presentations are concerned, for new presentations, this is the final one. All right, so we have discussed what the Apocrypha is, determined that that term really isn't the best. Ecclesiastical is better. We've talked about some really bad reasons to reject the Apocrypha that Protestants have used in modern times that are just not really good reasons. And in this video, we've talked about what the good reasons would be. That would be the reasons that actually show up in the Bible. The issues of authority agreement and authenticity, and we especially looked into detail on authenticity by way of a historical survey of early church fathers and what they had to say about the books that they were aware of in their time. We tallied all that data up, got our results, and we found the gaps in how books were treated that Protestants originally supposed that there would be, and then turns out that historically, mathematically, we can prove that that was exactly the case. These groups of books were not treated the same, and we can show the gap. All right. Thank you all very much for your time and attention. For those of you who are in Christ, go with God and be blessed. For those of you who are not, I pray that you would come to know the true Christ of history, the only genuine Savior and Master of Masters. Amen.